Hello again, everyone. You're joining us for another episode of Executive Platform's Blueprint podcast series. My name is Jeff Mix. I'm head of content and research. My guest today is René Buck of BCI Global. We're going to be having a conversation about some geopolitical issues that are facing manufacturers today. I'm really excited for this conversation. René, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Why don't we start off by talking about what is happening right now? What are some of the biggest issues that are impacting manufacturers around the world?
I think what you would say is that over the last 10 years, political and geopolitical developments have become more important in decisions of companies, in location decisions and footprint decisions, but also in the actions of government. So if you look for the current situation, I would say there are three important developments. One is that a lot of companies want to reduce their exposure to China. It's not meaning that they leave China altogether, but China was for many years the low-cost manufacturing powerhouse for the world. And due to the geopolitical tensions, the trade tariffs, due to security questions, a lot of companies want not further expand their activities in China. So that means that companies who, for example, have now 4 fantastic operating production lines in Shenzhen, in the southeast in China, if they want to expand now their capacity, typically they would say, well, let's do that in Shenzhen, great plant, great workforce, etc. But due to these political developments, supply chain disruption risk, they don't do that anymore. So now they put those 2 production lines in the US, in Mexico, in Europe, etc. So reducing exposure to China as well. China is just for everybody to know, is still the second largest market in the world, right? So for many companies, it's still a very interesting market. That's I would say, an important geopolitical development, which I forecasted 5 years ago would not change whoever would be in the White House. And now we are in an election year again. And now again, it doesn't matter who's in the White House. The tensions between the US and China, and the US and the Western world and China, are here to stay. It's about technology leadership. It's about a clash of economic systems. The second important development is obviously happening in Europe, where Putin invaded the Ukraine, which led to a lot of uncertainty among European companies and citizens. I was raised and born and raised in the Netherlands. Never thought that we would have a war again at 600-700 miles from my office where I live. And what also the war in Ukraine made clear is that the energy security is becoming an issue. So when Putin invaded Ukraine, one of the first measures was to cut off the gas pipeline between Russia and Germany. All of a sudden, Germany had not the reliability of electricity availability anymore. And if you would have asked me 10 years ago, René, would you ever doubt the reliability of energy availability in Germany? I would have laughed, say, no, that's not a question. But all of a sudden, electricity became an issue, not only on the cost side, which is always a concern for companies, but also that the reliability of availability was not guaranteed anymore. So that has made also energy-intensive companies, think about glass manufacturing or chemical industries, look into the US or to other parts of the world, because in Europe that was in disarray. And that was actually combined with super high inflation, high electricity costs. So the war, which was not in Europe itself, because Ukraine is not often seen as part of Europe, but caused also in Europe a lot of concern and uncertainty. And the third political developments I think is worthwhile to mention are the elections this year in the US. And a lot of geographies in the world, so take for example in Europe, you need 4 or 5 parties to form a government. So you have nobody has a majority. So what happens then is that if you form such a coalition, it's always a little bit gray, right? Because you need always parties in the middle, in the political arena, in the center, because otherwise you don't get a majority. But the positive impact is that you have more stability. Now, in the US, it's different. In the US is, like in the UK, more black and white, or say here, red and blue. And that means also for US companies, but also for foreign companies, quite some uncertainties. What will happen with the green policies of Biden? What will happen with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act? What about stimulating electric vehicles and batteries? So that uncertainty, particularly in that black and white situation, is also for companies an important development to monitor. The consequence will be that a lot of companies are still preparing investment plans. But I think a lot of companies, like in previous election years, will push the brake button in terms of taking decisions.
So it's interesting that you mention, the idea of a black and white, who's going to be in charge government, because of course governments are also setting policy that are trying to balance out some of these geopolitical considerations. I wonder if we can talk about that from the perspective of what it means for manufacturers. What are governments doing to address some of these issues?
I think the governments try to cope with these geopolitical challenges in two ways. One is protecting their own markets, and the other is stimulating companies to come to that market. So we see the US government, we see the European Commission trying to protect their home market with import duties, with tariffs, with scrutiny of products to be manufactured in the US, for example. With quotas. So let's say it's not that free world of trade anymore, what companies are doing. And then they combine it with substantial incentive and tax programs, like here in the US with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. In Europe, we have also more or less similar type of measures. So countries who act a little bit nationalistic, protectionistic, try to get a secure environment, and they call it often strategic autonomy. So they invite chip manufacturers from all over the world to produce in the US. And in Europe, they have programs to attract semiconductor companies to Europe. And in Japan, they have programs to attract semiconductor companies to Japan. So everybody wants to be sure that for critical chips, for semiconductors, that you produce them locally. So the combination of protectionism and, on the other hand, teasing measures to seduce companies to invest in the areas, that's what's happening. Interesting is also that they do it with R&D programs. So it's not only like, hey, if you manufacture here, you get so many tax breaks or so many tax credits. I think the US has taken the lead in the Biden administration also by setting up R&D programs. So in the CHIPS Act, the well-known CHIPS Act in the US, there is a substantial part, not only on production, but also on research and development. And that is also because a lot of companies, a lot of countries who want to attract, for example, semicon companies, you need an ecosystem. You know, if you in a semiconductor plant, you need thousands of spare parts, of assemblies, of components, etc. And they're coming from all over the world. So you want to set up your semiconductor plant in an area where also those suppliers are. So take TSMC, it's the largest Taiwanese semiconductor company, one of the largest in the world actually. They are setting up in Arizona, in Phoenix, they are setting up in the eastern part of Germany. And together with that TSMC wafer fab, there are also suppliers coming into that. So you need an ecosystem to really, for companies to be interesting. So after the question what the governments are doing, what other companies are doing? Now the companies are to a certain extent, acting, moving more towards region for region production. So you have a plant in the US or Mexico to cover the North American market. You have a plant in Europe to cover the European market. You have a plant in Southeast Asia to cover the APEC market. And you have a plant in China to cover China, because China is a market in itself these days. And that region for region production, we call it officially decentralization of production. Media often call it reshoring, bringing production back. That means for a lot of companies a change in their footprint in terms of, hey, not expanding anymore in Asia, but more in the market where your customers are, whether that's in Europe or in the US. So that region for region production is really something what we see happening in many consultancy assignments, what we do. As you know, one of our specialisms as BCI Global is to take a global look at manufacturing footprints. What products are you producing where, with what technologies, for what markets, against what cost? And that decentralization, that de-risking your supply chain, being less dependent on China, being closer to your clients, reducing your transportation bill, at the meantime also reducing your CO2 emission levels. That's something what we see happening in many industries these days. Again, for some companies, China is still a very interesting market in itself. But that decentralization of production is something what's going on. That's, for example, also why Mexico is so hot these days. So many American and Western companies, including Japanese, Korean companies, are setting up in Mexico because they want to cover the US market, but against the lower competitive costs which Mexico can offer in comparison with the US. And actually, we expect also that will happen in research and development. So that also companies don't say, yeah, we have only 1 or 2 labs in the world where our great new products will be developed, but that they also will take a more regional look, taking advantage of technology bases, talent bases around the world, so accelerate their R&D and innovation output process. So basically what you see is, on the geopolitical side, important developments with China, with Russia, and with US elections. Governments acting a little bit protectionistic, but also covering their own interest and stimulating companies to, in critical areas, to invest in their region, whether it's in Europe, Japan, India, or the US. And companies who are trying to look into giving these new circumstances, what is a robust, resilient footprint? Now we have, these days, we have 10 offices around the world, so 4 in the US, 3 in Asia, and 3 in Europe. And the majority of our teams are working on what is for our clients the best manufacturing footprint, and should you choose for new locations. Now that is what we do since 1985.
René, I feel like I could talk about geopolitical stuff with you all day, and I appreciate it's actually what your consulting group does. You help companies make informed decisions. Every manufacturer is going to have their own story, their own questions. For people who have been listening to this and maybe want to pick your brain or the brain of some of your colleagues, what is the best way to get in touch?
Now, it's a little bit obvious to say, well, reach out to one of our 10 offices around the world. You will find experts there. But I think it's an important element in our way of working is we really like professional sparring. So if companies say, well, we are crunching our head here about a certain topic, or how will we do that? They can reach out to us. We will set up a call, an online meeting. If they want to sign an NDA, no problem. We will not charge for the first or second workshop, because we want to understand what really for them is the challenge, and then say, okay, well, this is the way how we could help you, whether that's in North America, whether that's in China, in Southeast Asia, and in Europe, because as a global boutique consulting company, we are doing that. And as a last point I want to share is Forbes magazine makes every year an overview since 2 years of the best management consulting companies in the world. And for the 2 years, we are on that ranking of 190 companies, showing also that as a global boutique consulting company, you can do great work for companies because this ranking is based on the recommendations of our clients.
Well, I think that's a terrific place to wrap this conversation up. But I do want to say I always enjoy speaking with you and your peers. It's always interesting to hear what is going on, and I think you provide a really valuable service to manufacturing and supply chain executives. So thank you so much for your time today, René.
Oh, and thank you for having me once again. Thank you.
You've been listening to another episode of Executive Platform's Blueprint podcast series. I've been Jeff Mix. Let's do it again soon.